The night was cold, sharper than usual, as I stood by the window watching the rain splatter across the city below. I didn't want to be here, in this sterile, glass and steel apartment. I didn't want to be anywhere near him. Not tonight. My phone buzzed, and for a moment I thought I might actually break it in my frustration. I stared at his name, the one that had haunted my every waking moment for years, now glowing on my screen, daring me to answer. The truth was, I didn't want to hear his voice. Not after everything, after he had kept me at arm's length for months. But the ache in my chest was unbearable, the silence between us worse than anything he could say. My thumb hovered over the screen, my heart pounding in my ears. Before I could make a decision, my doorbell rang and I felt the blood drain from my face. He was here. I hadn't told him where I lived. He didn't know. I was certain of it. But there he was, his voice soft and urgent through the door. "Please open up, I need to talk." His words pierced me in a way that was too familiar, too desperate, too full of things we had never said. I hesitated for a moment, anger swirling with a tangled mess of longing and betrayal. There was no way I was letting him in. Not tonight. But the urge to feel his presence, to confront him, was overwhelming. I unlocked the door. The moment I opened it, I was hit with the weight of his eyes, the intensity that always had the power to leave me breathless. He stepped inside without a word, but I could feel the tension in his body, the pain he was carrying. It was in the way he moved, the hesitation in his hands, as if he wasn't sure whether I would let him close enough to touch. His jaw tightened as he looked around, trying to read me, to find the pieces of what had been between us in the past. But all I could see was a stranger in the body of the person I had once loved, someone I had entrusted with my heart and then, heartbreakingly, lost. "I know you don't want to see me, but I couldn't leave without explaining," he said, his voice cracked, raw. It wasn't the apology I was expecting. It wasn't the confession of love or the sorrowful admission of mistakes I had dreamed of. Instead, it was something else, something heavy, too heavy to be ignored. I wanted to turn away, to slam the door in his face, but the desperation in his eyes kept me frozen, unable to move. "Why now?" I whispered, my voice trembling more than I intended. I felt it, the dangerous edge of vulnerability creeping in, as if this was a moment we could never take back. He was shaking his head, his fingers curling into fists as if trying to hold back everything he had kept buried. And then, with a deep breath, he said something that would change everything between us forever. "I wasn't the one who walked away, you were." I blinked, the words landing on me like a slap. My mind scrambled to process them, to find the logic, the reason behind his claim. But it didn't make sense. He was the one who had pulled away, who had built walls that I couldn't climb. He was the one who had shoved me out of his life without a word, without a reason, leaving me to pick up the pieces. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice a mere rasp. And then he stepped closer, just a few inches away, his eyes never leaving mine. He reached out slowly, almost as if testing whether I would pull away. But I couldn't. I didn't. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch as familiar as the back of my own hand, sending a jolt through me that was both electric and excruciating. For a long moment, we stood there, frozen, caught in the gravity of what had been and what had never fully been. And then he whispered, "You walked away when I needed you most, and you never even knew it." His voice cracked on the last word, and it shattered everything I had thought I knew. I had never left. I had always stayed, even when he had pushed me away, even when he had been distant, colder than anyone should have been. I wanted to shout, to deny everything, but the rawness in his voice stopped me. He didn't move, didn't break contact, as if there was something between us that was too fragile to shatter. Instead, he leaned in slowly until his forehead rested gently against mine. "I was scared too, you know," he murmured. The words hung in the air, suspended between us, a quiet confession that felt like the first step toward something neither of us had ever dared to confront. Then, the real shock hit. As if the universe itself had decided to play a twisted game with us, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. It was never him. "You're not the one he's been waiting for." My body froze, the message flashing in my mind, a brutal reminder that nothing was ever as it seemed. He wasn't here to fix us. He wasn't here because he cared. I wasn't sure what this was anymore. The night had become a blur of contradictions, of truths that shattered into pieces I didn't know how to pick up. And then, with that one touch, everything between us had changed forever. I pulled back, suddenly unable to breathe. My chest felt tight as if something inside me was trying to escape. The message on my phone still buzzed in my hand, taunting me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it again. Instead, I found myself staring at him, at his face, so close to mine. He was waiting for me to say something, but all I could hear were the whispers of that message echoing in my mind. It was never him. The words were like shards of glass, slicing through everything I thought I knew about us. My gaze dropped to the floor, and for a second I wished I could just disappear into it, away from the storm we had become. But there was nowhere to hide now. The silence between us felt heavier than it ever had. He noticed the shift in me immediately, the way I pulled back, the way my body seemed to withdraw, like I was a shell of the person I had been moments ago. He stepped away, and the distance between us was a new kind of pain, sharper and more intense than I ever expected. I didn't want to look at him, didn't want to face the truth of what was happening. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something beneath it, guilt, regret, or maybe fear. For a moment he didn't say anything. He just looked at me as if waiting for me to figure it out. Then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke again, this time his voice almost breaking. "I didn't come here to hurt you. I came here to tell you the truth." I felt a cold shiver run through me. Truth? What truth? Everything felt like a lie, a web of tangled emotions I couldn't untangle no matter how hard I tried. "You walked away when I needed you most," he had said, but I didn't remember that. I didn't remember walking away. I only remembered the way he had shut me out, the walls he had built around himself when I needed him more than ever. The nights we spent in silence, the days I spent waiting for him to reach out, to acknowledge the bond we shared, only to be met with distance, with coldness. My hands trembled as I wiped the rain from the window. My reflection stared back at me, distorted like I was seeing myself through someone else's eyes. I couldn't recognize that person. And yet here he was, standing before me, telling me I was the one who had walked away. The irony was unbearable. It made no sense. Why didn't he fight for us? I wanted to scream. Why didn't he come to me when I needed him? But instead I stood there frozen, unable to voice the questions that were clawing at me. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope, the edges worn and torn like it had been carried around for far too long. He handed it to me without a word. I stared at it for a long moment before slowly taking it from his hand, my fingers brushing against his, sending a ripple of electricity through me. The weight of the envelope was unexpected. It felt heavier than anything I had ever held before. I ripped it open, the paper inside crinkling as I unfolded it. The letter was simple, but the words it contained sent a rush of emotions I wasn't ready to handle. "I've always loved you, but I was afraid." That was the first sentence, and it shook me to my core. It was something I had wanted to hear for so long, but it was not the confession I had imagined. It wasn't the words of someone trying to make amends. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise that we could find our way back to each other. Instead, it was a fragile truth buried beneath years of regret and fear. My hands shook as I read the rest, as the story of his silence, of his withdrawal, unraveled before me in black ink. The pain in his words was palpable. "I never knew how to love you the way you needed. I thought I could push it away. But the truth is, I've been waiting for you to tell me how you felt, waiting for you to come back. And I didn't know how to let you go until now." The letter crumpled in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I wanted to so badly. I wanted to just burn it, to erase it from my memory. But there was something in it that kept me rooted to the spot, something in those words that shattered the walls I had built around myself. For the first time in years, I felt a rush of understanding, of recognition, of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. But there was still something so wrong, so painfully off about this moment, something that didn't sit right. He had been waiting for me, waiting for me. Was that what he had been doing all this time? It didn't make sense. The anger and betrayal I had felt, the pain I had carried for so long, had it all been a misunderstanding? I wanted to scream, to rage at him for putting me through this, for making me feel like I was the one who was wrong. But when I looked into his eyes, all I saw was the same confusion, the same hurt. And suddenly, everything I thought I knew about him, about us, was no longer clear. Nothing was as it seemed. I stood there, the letter crumpled in my hand, staring at him as if he were a stranger, an unfamiliar ghost of the person I once thought I knew. The world around me seemed to grow quieter, as if the rain itself had slowed its rhythm to match the thundering silence between us. I could barely hear my own heartbeat, but I could feel it, pounding violently against my chest, pushing against the words he had just revealed. "Waiting for you to tell me how you felt," he had written, but in his eyes I saw a different story. The intensity of his gaze was pulling at something inside me, something I couldn't name but couldn't escape either. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my throat felt too tight, too raw. How was I supposed to process this? How could I even begin to understand the years of pain, the years of silence that we had endured because of this twisted web of miscommunication? My mind was a blur. Had he really been waiting for me? Had I misunderstood everything? The question gnawed at me, refusing to let me go, and with each passing second, my anger seemed to evaporate into a bitter confusion. I wanted to demand the truth, to have him explain how he had let me walk away, how he had allowed all of this to unravel. But instead, I found myself walking to the small kitchen in the corner of the room, numbly setting the crumpled letter on the counter. I could feel his eyes on me, could sense the shift in the air, as if he was afraid of what I might do next. But I couldn't bring myself to face him right away. I wasn't ready. When I finally turned back to him, I saw the same brokenness in his eyes that I had been hiding in my own heart for so long. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It was a question that had haunted me for so many months, a question that felt too big for this moment, too heavy for the fragile space between us. He ran a hand through his hair, and I saw the frustration building in him, the weight of the years we had wasted. "I didn't know how to," he admitted, his voice strained. "I didn't know how to be the person you needed when I couldn't even figure out how to be the person I needed." The words stung, but they were honest. There was a rawness to them that I couldn't ignore, a vulnerability that pulled me closer, even as everything inside me screamed for distance. I stepped back, my mind racing. I thought of all the nights I spent crying, all the times I had begged him to open up, to tell me what was going on in his head, to stop pushing me away. And now, here he was, finally opening up, but it felt like too little, too late. The years of silence, of longing, of heartache, I couldn't just erase them. I couldn't simply pretend they had never happened. And yet, as I looked at him standing there, vulnerable in a way I had never seen before, something inside me softened. It wasn't forgiveness, at least not yet, but there was a crack in the armor I had built around myself. I wanted to reach out to tell him that I understood, that I was here, but something held me back. The fear of being hurt again, the fear of giving him a piece of me that he could shatter just as easily as he had before, stopped me. "I don't know if I can believe you," I finally said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore." The words tasted bitter on my tongue, but they felt true. I had trusted him once, and he had walked away without a word, without a trace of explanation. And now, he was asking me to trust him again, to believe that everything that had happened between us wasn't just a lie. His face fell, the hope in his eyes dimming as I spoke. I could see the hurt in him, the way he flinched at the weight of my words, but I couldn't stop myself. I had been broken too many times to let him back in so easily. But then, without warning, he did something that no one had ever done before. He stepped forward, closing the space between us until we were standing so close that I could feel the heat of his breath on my skin. For a moment, I thought he might try to kiss me, but instead he simply took my hand in his, tentative, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if I would pull away. I didn't. My body seemed to betray me, pulling me toward him despite the storm of emotions I was feeling. And in that moment, something strange happened. I didn't feel the rage, the betrayal, or even the fear of getting hurt again. Instead, all I felt was this quiet, deep ache, a longing for something I couldn't quite name, but something that was always there, lurking beneath the surface. His fingers tightened around mine just a fraction, a silent plea for me to understand, for me to let go of the past and reach for whatever was left between us. It was a gesture so simple, so raw, but it felt like everything was hanging on it. I couldn't explain it, but in that brief touch, I felt the weight of everything we had been through, the hurt, the distance, the miscommunication. And for the first time in so long, I wondered if it was possible to fix us. For a long moment, we stood there, our hands intertwined, the world outside forgotten, the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on us. The silence was no longer awkward, no longer charged with the tension of years spent apart. It was different now. It was heavy with possibility, with unspoken understanding, like the calm before a storm. I could feel his pulse beneath my fingertips, the rhythm of it matching my own. I thought about pulling my hand away, about stepping back, but I didn't. I couldn't. There was something about the way he was holding on to me, so gently but so desperately, that made it impossible to move. His eyes were searching mine, looking for something, anything, that would tell him I was still here, still open to him in some way. And I realized as I stared into the depths of those eyes that I was. I wanted to tell him everything I had been holding in for so long, the pain, the frustration, the confusion. But the words wouldn't come. They felt like they were stuck in my throat, tangled in the emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel. The fear that had kept me distant from him for so long suddenly felt like a distant memory. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it was quieter now, less insistent. I wanted to believe in him, to believe that what he had just said, what he had written in that letter, was true. But I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that had been creeping in since he first showed up at my door. What if this was all just another lie? "Why didn't you fight for us?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I thought I saw his eyes flicker with something, guilt, maybe, or shame. His grip on my hand tightened and he took a slow step closer, his face inches from mine. The air between us felt charged, as if one small movement could set everything ablaze. "I didn't know how to fight for something I wasn't sure was even there anymore," he said quietly, his voice low, vulnerable. "I pushed you away because I was scared, scared of losing you, scared of losing myself. And I thought if I kept my distance, I could protect us both from the inevitable heartache. But I was wrong." The honesty in his voice was a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this moment, this fragile connection we were starting to rebuild, could be something real. But it wasn't that simple, was it? I had loved him once, loved him with a fierce, reckless abandon that had both scared and exhilarated me. And when he pulled away, when he shut me out, it felt like a betrayal. A deep, unshakable betrayal that I had never fully recovered from. I had built walls around myself, built a life without him, and now, in the face of everything he was saying, I was supposed to just tear those walls down. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. My heart wasn't ready for that. But then he did something that changed everything again. Without a word, he reached up and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my face, his fingers grazing my skin with a tenderness that made my breath catch in my throat. I froze, the touch so familiar, so intimate that it felt like I had been transported back in time to when we were inseparable, when his presence was the only thing that made sense in my world. My eyes closed involuntarily, and for the briefest of moments I let myself remember what it had felt like to be with him, to be loved by him. And in that moment, everything, the doubts, the anger, the fear, began to slip away, like sand through my fingers. "You don't have to decide right now," he said softly, his voice laced with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for you to forget. I'm just asking for a chance to show you that I'm here, that I'm still here, and I want to fight for us, for whatever we can be if you're willing." His words were a lifeline, a fragile thread that pulled me toward him in ways I couldn't resist. But even as I felt that pull, I knew the truth. I wasn't sure if I was ready to fight too. The journey we had been on was a long and painful one, and I didn't know if we could ever go back to what we had been, or if we even should. But in his touch, in his words, I felt a spark of something that might be enough to start again, even if it was only a small flame. He took a step back then, giving me the space I didn't realize I needed, and I felt a cold emptiness wash over me. But it was different this time. The distance between us wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a quiet space for us to breathe, to think. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "Whenever you're ready." His words hung in the air as the rain began to fall harder outside, a soft drumbeat that matched the rhythm of my racing heart. And for the first time in so long, I wasn't sure where this was headed, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Moments where the past seemed to haunt me at every turn, and others where the present felt so fragile, so new, that I wasn't sure how to grasp it. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, the night he held me, the night the words he spoke began to unravel everything I thought I knew about him, about us. His presence lingered in the spaces between my thoughts, in the quiet moments when I wasn't busy convincing myself that I was better off alone. What if he's telling the truth? What if I've been holding on to this pain for so long that I've forgotten how to let go? The question looped in my head, making it impossible to think clearly. And yet, the more I wrestled with those thoughts, the clearer it became that I wasn't just afraid of what had happened in the past. I was afraid of what might happen in the future. I had closed myself off for so long that the thought of opening up again, of trusting him again, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall into something I couldn't control. I didn't know if I was strong enough to risk it. I didn't know if I could let him back in without destroying everything I had built to protect myself. But the memory of his touch, the way his hand had felt in mine, so warm and real, kept pulling me back to that night when he held me and everything changed. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out again. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't some grand gesture. It was a simple text, a message that appeared on my phone one afternoon. "I'm still here if you want to talk." There it was. No pressure, no demands, just an invitation, a lifeline thrown out into the uncertain waters between us. I stared at the message for a long time, my finger hovering over the screen, unsure of how to respond. Every part of me wanted to shut it down, to ignore it, to protect myself from the possibility of more hurt. But another part of me, the part that had felt the spark when he had held me, couldn't let it go. I tapped out a response, my hands trembling as I did. "I'm not sure, but I'm willing to listen." It wasn't much, but it was a start. When we met up again, it was nothing like the first time he had come to my door. The tension was still there, but it was different now. There was an understanding between us, a tentative truce, as if we both knew that this was more than just about us. It was about learning to trust ourselves again. He sat across from me, his gaze soft but filled with the same intensity that had always been there, even when things between us were falling apart. I wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the depth of the hurt, the years of confusion, the feelings of abandonment, but I didn't. Instead, we just talked. We spoke about nothing and everything, about the lives we had built in each other's absence, about the things that had changed and the things that hadn't. And slowly, as the minutes passed, something shifted between us. Not all at once, not in some grand, dramatic way, but in small, subtle movements that spoke louder than words ever could. In the end, it wasn't the grand gestures that defined that night. It was the small, quiet moments, the way we slowly began to rebuild the foundation we had lost. It was the way he listened, really listened when I spoke as though my words mattered more than anything else. And it was the way, in the middle of our conversation, his hand brushed mine again, this time with no hesitation, no fear, just the simple desire to be close. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let him in. I let myself feel the warmth of his touch, the comfort of his presence, and for the first time in so long, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of us. Maybe after everything we could still find a way forward. But as I looked into his eyes, something deep inside me knew that this wasn't just a second chance. It was a chance to rewrite everything, to take all the pain, all the confusion, and transform it into something new, something real. And when he whispered, "I'm here," for whatever comes next, I realized that, for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. Because no matter what happened, no matter how much time had passed, the night he held me had changed everything between us. It had changed me.